we're going to be talking about personality. We're going to be talking about factors that influence personality, patterns that we see. It's very similar to our discussion about intelligence, where we talk a little bit about how might we define personality and how can we measure it, and then looking at genetic and environmental factors and things like that. So hopefully we'll start to fall into this pattern where a lot of those same concepts are going to hold true, even in different areas. So you've probably seen quite a few different personality tests. One of the most common ones here is, say, our Myers-Briggs personality types, where they have all of these different combinations that you can possibly be. And you've probably taken a couple of these at some point in time. We're going to go with far more official and standardized versions to look at our personality stuff. But I suppose we should start off with our discussion of what is personality? What's our definition here? So for us, it is an enduring set of internally based characteristics that create uniqueness and consistency in a person's thoughts and behaviors. That is a lot of stuff to consider, but we're focusing on a couple of components here. One of which being that this is something enduring, something long-lasting. So this means that this is consistency over time. Because oftentimes when we're looking at things, it's kind of hard to tell, is this, say, a current emotional state? Is this your current mood? Or is this actually something to do with your personality? Because both can strongly influence how you react in a situation. So when we're trying to quantify personality, we want to look at what happens over time. So by doing multiple measures or looking at all of those points in time, we're going to see that this instance might have been atypical, and we can attribute that to current internal state rather than something like our long-term personality effects. And we focus on uniqueness here, saying that each individual will react slightly differently than someone else because of these unique characteristics that we have. So you might have some similar responses, but overall there's a whole lot of different dimensions where most people are going to have fairly distinctive aspects to their personality. And we typically look at things like our behaviors because that's something that we can quantify and measure externally, but our personality will also affect internal processes and internal thoughts and things like that. So you might have a tendency to think about things certain ways. Maybe you are an individual who catastrophizes and thinks the worst, and that we'll see is related to something like neuroticism, where you tend to be fairly volatile and overreacting to situations. When we talk about our personality traits, these are what we're calling those internally based characteristics that we look at in combination to describe somebody's personality. So typically we'll have multiple traits that we can look at. And as you can probably expect, a lot of our models are going to differ a lot in how they break us down into those individual traits. Typically, we're going to see a lot of spectrums where you can score higher or lower for any given trait, but they like to divide it up very differently. So some have more or fewer individual traits, but we'll also see, just like with intelligence, a lot of the models end up showing a bunch of consistency using similar concepts, which tells us that this might be a common way for us to think about people's long-term patterns of behavior. But we can also look at, sometimes they'll frame it as this personality can help us explain or account for certain expressions of behavior. And this is just us saying that our personality, those traits, are going to be part of why we act a certain way. So when we look at somebody's response, we can say that this is partially because of their personality. We do still need to acknowledge that in any moment, there's also going to be some internal state. So if you were having a really bad day, that can definitely affect how you react in the moment. But overall, we can use personality to explain those consistencies in responses outside of individual events. All right, so that's a lot of setting us up with the base definitions. For the rest of the chapter, I believe I've divided this up based on broad categories of different theories. So you might remember talking about our psychodynamic perspective versus our cognitive perspective or behavioral perspective and so on and so forth. So we're going to break down a couple of those just because it's the easiest way to frame them, because often they have similar focuses, similar goals in mind when they're describing personality. So we're starting with our psychodynamic perspective, which hopefully by now gives you that automatic connection to this is the field associated with Freud, and therefore it's probably going to be one of the odder collections of different ideas and theories. So with our psychodynamic theorists, they are typically going to be focused on our unconscious, and typically on conflict and aggression and things like that. So they're looking for causes of behavior in this dynamic interplay of inner forces that are in conflict with one another. It's a pretty decent description of how these all work. So it's based on work by Freud, but there are also other individuals that have built on top of those theories or modified them as time goes on. We will also, as per usual, see that when we get into some of the other theories in the other fields, many of those were proposed directly in contrast to some of Freud's theories and some of his followers' theories as well. Oftentimes our motivation is, we hated this so much, we came up with our own option that we think is much better. And that pattern, that back and forth, is something that we see not just with personality, we've seen it in all the other topics as well. And so I said it, I believe, but just in case, all of this, that dynamic interplay and focusing on inner forces, we're stressing that these are the unconscious inner forces, where most of the time this isn't stuff that we are consciously aware of. So this is things running in our deep, dark subconscious, things where we'll have lots of those conflicts generating a lot of built-up energy that are going to need to be sort of spent or released in different environments. So their focus, as per usual, really leans into the effect of early childhood experiences. So what you encountered growing up really shaped how your unconscious works. And so Freud especially was really focused in on getting people to uncover, say, detrimental encounters or traumatic experiences from their childhood. And this is probably going to relate to a lot of the history where people were uncovering what ended up being false memories. Because when you ask very leading questions with the base assumption that something happened, people can often start filling in the blanks. And with the fact that our memories are a lot less stable than what people think, as you access those memories over and over again, any of those bits that you fill in those blanks, they actually get stored as if they were originally part of the memory. And so over time, you can become convinced that this event actually happened. Next, we get our unconscious conflicts. And so this actually ties over to this first point here of psychic energy, which is the actual term that Freud used. And this is energy that's generated by those conflicts, those opposing forces within our unconscious that are trying to break out. So he had said that this energy is generated by a whole bunch of our instinctual drives, because of course Freud was very focused on aggressive and sexual urges, things that were sort of pushing you to act against societal norms, but not being able to act on those impulses leads to sort of this buildup of energy. And he said that you had to find a way to discharge it. So you could discharge it directly, which might actually lead to things like being aggressive or acting on sexual urges. Or it could be more of an indirect discharge. So instead of starting a fight, maybe you go for a run to try and get rid of some of that excess energy in a much more acceptable way. You could also maybe pick up a hobby like boxing, where it is appropriate to be aggressive in that environment so that now you're doing it in a more healthy way, or at least a more socially acceptable way. So you could reduce some of that conflict. hopping back, that tells us, so yeah, we did the unconscious conflicts driven by those sexual and aggressive urges. And the reason why he was so convinced that this was what was going on, and to the point that he leaned into this as the major drive for how we behave over time, it's because he was looking at a lot of extreme cases, a lot of individuals with psychological disorders that had no other explanation, so it had to be something internal and not biological. So he was famous for studying things like conversion hysteria, where people would come in and maybe they were blind, but they had no damage to their eyes or to the parts of the brain involved in perceiving things. It was just that some maybe trauma, mental trauma, something psychological was leading to these physical manifestations. And so a lot of his work was having long talks with his clients to figure out what kinds of psychological trauma had led to these extreme expressions. And so that's where he determined that it must be these built up urges that weren't being filtered properly, causing damage because they weren't going anywhere. And this ties into psychoanalysis, which is the treatment procedure that Freud ended up pioneering. That was his way of figuring out what was wrong with these individuals and basically teaching them to channel things in a way that he thought was acceptable. A lot of Freud's theories on how therapy should proceed, which we'll talk about in treatment of psychological disorders at the end, but he did long, long sessions, usually every single day for months or even years, until he understood a person's unconscious mind, in his mind, as much as possible, and he would slowly try and change the way that they thought from the ground up. So this was a very time-consuming and extensive process, but also very strongly based around whatever he thought was the correct way that people should be thinking. So we can keep a lot of that in mind when we look at some of his theories. But it wasn't just conversion hysteria. He also looked at individuals with irrational fears or phobias, obsessions, anxieties, all sorts of different psychological disorders. And at the time, there weren't a whole lot of options for people to receive treatment for any of those disorders. He did end up almost exclusively treating those who were fairly wealthy and who could afford to put their lives on pause for years on end while he treated their disorders. Other individuals would probably have just ended up in asylums or institutions. Okay, so we covered the psychic energy stuff. We can also talk about how he decided to break down our sort of levels of consciousness and how our personality structures fit within that. So you might have figured out already, we can talk about our conscious mind, things that we are accurately aware of or currently aware of. So while you're sitting in class, hopefully listening to what I'm saying, that is part of your conscious mind because you are thinking about it right now. Our unconscious would be the things that we are unaware of, and specifically stuff that we don't easily become aware of. That's the area that Freud wanted to target, these things that were being repressed or hidden away beyond the possibility of us knowing about them. So he was delving into this stuff that was sort of pushed down so far that we didn't even know it existed. Hence his seeking for things like repressed memories and past traumas and things like that. We then also have our preconscious, and this is the stuff that we are not currently aware of, but could easily become aware of. So this is things like, if I ask you what you had for breakfast this morning, you are now thinking about it, but you retrieved that information from your preconscious. So before you think about it, it's stored somewhere you can get to, but once you think about it, it transitions into your conscious mind. So we have the conscious, preconscious, unconscious understanding. The way that this diagram, and this is a really common diagram to represent how this works, where we think about the conscious as sort of the tip of the iceberg, stuff that's visible to the world, stuff that you are consciously aware of. Then the preconscious being what's just below the surface. It's still visible, you can see it, but it's not something that's visible immediately from the surface. And then the id being the lower levels, things that are inaccessible, things that are way too deep down to observe, things beyond our reach. I don't know if it's the best explanation, but it's the one that all the textbooks use, so we have it too. He then proceeded to talk about 3 different structures of personality that would fit within some of these different categories, and specifically that might be contained within one or more of those categories. So we're going to look at the id, the ego, and the superego, which are another one of those really famous topics that Freud was known for. And each of these have their own slide or multiple slides, but our id is the one that exists entirely within our unconscious mind. And he said that this is what ends up occurring first. We develop this process first. And it's the innermost core of our personality because it is pure, uninfluenced by society behavior or intent for behavior. So he calls this his source of all psychic energy, tying back to his last slide there. And when we're born, this is the only structure that's present. And he said here that this is driven entirely by those innate urges that we have at birth, eventually becoming aggression and sex. But when we're younger, focusing on things like food and comfort and contact with others. So he would say that infants are completely at the whims of whatever their darkest or their deepest urges. I don't know that you could say dark urges, but they want food, so they take food. You leave out cookies, and if they want them, they're going to eat all of them. So this is completely irrational, meaning that we don't have this conscious manipulation or filtering of it. It's not something that we could consciously access because it's trapped in that unconscious level. And he said that this was controlled by the pleasure principle, which is effectively that if you want something, you take it. You are driven by impulse and urges, and you just act on whatever it is that you want the most. So you seek immediate gratification or release of that buildup of psychic energy. And in this situation, this would be stuff that you would want to do regardless of our rational considerations or the reality of your environment. That's that you're not subject to society's rules and standards. So this is your basic urges, the core of your personality. We can then get into our ego, and this is the one that develops next. And this primarily functions at our conscious level. However, it can cross some of those boundaries. If we go over here, we can see that the ego is going to be more in that conscious, spanning the preconscious. And what it's going to do is, basically its role is to keep control of the id. So it's going to suppress those impulses. It's going to prevent us from acting in ways that are socially unacceptable. So this has a decision-making component. We are consciously deciding, do we act on this impulse or not? So this gives us self-control, allows us to delay gratification. If it's something that you can't act on, maybe you wait until you can find an indirect way to burn off that energy, or maybe you have an environment where it is acceptable to engage in those urges. For this one, we're focused on the reality principle. And that's basically saying we're going to look at reality. We're going to look at the current environment. So they say test reality to decide when the id could safely discharge those impulses and satisfy those needs and urges. So this could be a when, it could also be a where or under what conditions. But this is us critically thinking about, can I do this now or not? Or do I need to wait, and what would I need to wait for? And so they relate this to a concept called secondary process thinking, but this is just their fancy way of saying, how could we maximize our gratification? How much of those urges and impulses can we embrace without negative consequences of violating society's assumptions or expectations? So kind of our pros and cons, what can I get away with? And there might be some matter of, well, we can tolerate some consequences, but only to this point. So we are thinking it through and deciding what are the consequences and is that acceptable or not. Our last topic, or our last sort of category, is the superego. So this is the final one to develop. Unlike the other two that have their own principles that run it, the superego doesn't. But this is when we introduce morality. So this is when we start thinking about not can I act on this or not. This is more of a should I. So this is controlling our impulses from the id in a more external way. They're saying here, this goes against what we've seen with, say, Kohlberg's theory of morality, but different areas. This says that it's going to develop by the age of 4 or 5, and this is where we're going to start understanding, is this something that is acceptable or not? Is this something that is moral or not? And being a little bit more critical in your evaluations. So it's kind of like an evolution or an advancement from our ego, just being a little bit more accurate and a little bit more self-driven when we're deciding, can we do this thing or not, or should we do this thing or not? We make a note that our ego cannot always control the id, and that's where we get some of that conflict, where we can't get rid of some of that energy, we can't diffuse that energy, and so we've created conflict, and that can lead to things like anxiety because we have that urge to get rid of the excess psychic energy. And when we have that, it's basically us worried that our id is going to get out of control, that we're not going to be able to hold back those impulses. And so he proposed a bunch of defense mechanisms to help us get rid of or alleviate or hide that anxiety. So we've probably heard defense mechanisms a lot more than some of the other of Freud's theories, because this is something that's still mentioned and still talked about today. But these are things that the ego would set out and use as sort of a weapon to hold off the id. So many of these, pretty much all of these, are distortions of reality. So how can we change the way that we see this situation? How can we fool ourselves so that we can keep that conflict away? How can we ignore things or change things or something like that? And he said that these defense mechanisms are the cause of our maladaptive behavior. And these are things we're not aware that we're doing. It's just the way that that ego is pushing down the id at that lower level of our unconscious. Very abstract discussions, but we can look at what some of these defense mechanisms are. So repression, so keeping those distressing thoughts and feelings buried in the unconscious. You can force yourself not to think about this. You can repress a memory or repress a certain knowledge or something like that. You can project, where you could attribute your own thoughts, feelings, or motives to somebody else. So it's not me, it's them. You can displace, so you can divert those emotional feelings, especially for things like anger, from some original source, the thing that is actually making you angry, to some other source. So this would be how he'd explain things like lashing out in anger at someone who hasn't done anything wrong, or blowing up at something that was really small and not really deserving of that level of response. I'm not going to go into all of these because you can all read them. Regression is one of the common ones where you would, instead of dealing with your current life, you would sort of regress or retreat back to a safer state like you felt when you were a child. Rationalization is an interesting one. And this is when you basically come up with an excuse or cover story that makes sense to explain away whatever it is that's causing you that anxiety. So you're going to come up with that excuse to justify that behavior in a way sort of tricking your mind into thinking it's not a bad thing anymore, not something that you should be worried about. So yeah, all of these different defense mechanisms were originally proposed by Freud. Whenever we talk Freud, it just keeps getting weirder and weirder. If you've heard of these, you know where I'm coming from, but the stages of psychosexual development were also a proposal within this field. And we've just come out of stages of development, a bunch of stage theories in that chapter. But here, it's specifically focusing on stuff that Freud thought was important, specifically aggression and sex, as per always. This is one of those that was very frowned upon by other areas pretty much right away, specifically because he focused on sexual gratification, especially starting with children. So he said that this process, this series of stages, it's all focused on different specific pleasure-sensitive areas of the body, and that children would progress through all of these stages in a particular order, and that would reflect upon their adult personality depending on how they encountered those stages. And of course, he looks for where things go wrong and cause deviant behavior. So he talked about fixation, where an individual could sort of stop at a particular stage and fixate on that stage for longer than normal, which could then lead to problematic behavior in the future. So he has all of these stages, the oral, anal, phallic stage, latency, I was trying to remember what that one is. Oh, that was just looking at developing social relationships, so that one isn't as weird as the others. And then genital when we get into puberty. So these, like I said, they ended up being fairly controversial because A, not a whole heck of a lot of support, and B, framing things this way with children was then and is still something that people don't really support. And that actually gives us a nice transition into how do we critically evaluate these theories. And it's really hard to say that this isn't occurring. They are not great theories in that they don't give us a testable hypothesis. And so there's a lot of problems there where people might not get support for it, but we also don't get tons of support against it because we can't frame it in a way that we can test. Unconscious processes is an interesting field, and this is probably the only component that got carried forward because we definitely do see the effect of non-conscious actions. So we can have stuff going on in the background that we are not consciously aware of that can influence our behavior. So things like if we look at stereotypes, there are all sorts of tests that can look at inherent and unknown biases. There's a really, really neat test that does things like the one I'm thinking of is for race bias, where they'll show pictures of individuals of either, or of a category of races, and then they will show either positive or negative words and see how quickly you can learn to associate positive or negative words with different races. And the latency to respond would show that if you have negative views of a group, it is harder for you to associate positive words with them, so it would take longer to make that response. And when you do the test, they actually give you a report at the end of the difference in latency and how much of that unconscious bias exists. I have seen in some ethics classes where they'll actually do that. Nobody shares their results because ethics, but it does show that even if it's not something conscious, there can be those under the surface influences on behavior. And that's just one example. It's the first that came to mind, but there are tons of other things that we aren't thinking about that can influence how we act. The psychosexual stages was definitely and outright rejected pretty much right off the bat. There's also some issues, and this shouldn't be specific to the psychosexual stages, but we have issues with the fact that our early experiences and things like emotional attachment early on in life can play a role, but the way that Freud framed it was these early life experiences were the driving force and the only factor that mattered. Because even if we look at the id, ego, and superego, he talked about that superego developing by 4 or 5 years of age, meaning that all of this development, all of these important stages were things that were done before we hit puberty. So that's not necessarily the way that any views nowadays would frame things. We do acknowledge that those early experiences can absolutely shape behavior over time. However, they're not the only forces that are involved. So all of that being our psychodynamic perspective, all of that was specific to Freud and Freud's immediate sort of underlings. But there are other non-Freudian, or here called neo-Freudian perspectives. And these are just adjustments, changes, people that took what he started with and put their own spin on it. I don't go into tons of detail on these, I don't believe, but a lot of these were students of Freud who didn't want to stay exactly where he was with his theories. So we'll look at Jung and Adler and Horney, which I always check is how you pronounce it, but it always is. But they really wanted to focus on how can we frame things differently, what can we fix, what don't we like, what can we do better. As per usual, they hate something and want to fix it in their own way. And especially Horney, so Karen Horney, was really important trying to counterbalance Freud's bias against women in a lot of his studies, because he talked a lot about women being, say, the weaker sex or more susceptible to those psychological shortcomings, but that could have also been strongly influenced by A, the societal views at the time, and B, the bias in who he was treating and sort of the gender difference between who he was treating. But she also stressed the importance of culture, where she didn't make that assumption that sort of everything was always the same in every part of the world. She wanted to look at the potential for cultural diversity and more widespread social influences. So what are the basics for each of these? We're going to focus on the stuff that makes them each distinct or unique or special in some way. So Carl Jung was a psychiatrist in Switzerland. So he actually wasn't directly under Freud in his studies. He actually started corresponding with Freud by writing letters back and forth. And they had a lot of debates about theories and what they should or shouldn't be including. So he called his approach analytical psychology because he really wanted to be separate from the psychoanalytic theories. So similar but slightly different name. He still emphasized the unconscious just like Freud did. However, he decided to lean into what he called the collective unconscious. So for Freud, it would be the personal unconscious, so each individual's inner urges, but a collective unconscious is this unconscious store of things beyond our awareness that has the experiences of past generations from ancestors around the world. Basically, he said that we have this innate knowledge that gets passed down just because people are people and we all have shared unaware experiences. So he talked a lot about that ancestral knowledge, and he called the categories of ancestral knowledge archetypes, which actually I have a slide for, checking ahead. So these archetypes, unlike maybe how you might frame it today, these are these universal thought patterns. And these can also include things like images or rituals, but basically that these were activities or events or things that would come to mind when triggered appropriately in the environment. So some specific aspect of this situation or some symbol that you encounter or some kind of image could trigger you to have these innate associations with stuff in that collective unconscious, so that all people should react fairly similarly in these conditions. So he called them sort of the rebel, sage, hero, and so on. However, nowadays when we look at a lot of those innate responses to certain situations, we would call those some of our reflexes, things that often end up tied to innate biological drives. But at the time, this is what he attributed those to, was this collective unconscious. And for his evidence, we do see that collection of tendencies that people share, but again, we explain it maybe as reflexes and biological predispositions rather than something that's driven by an unconscious shared base of knowledge. There are some things, like if we look at some of those predispositions, things like having a quick ability to recognize things that are dangerous. So I always go back to the study where they look at classical conditioning, and it is easier to classically condition a startle response or a fear response to things like snakes and spiders, the things that should be recognized as threatening. And it's easier to make that association than it is to make that association with neutral things like, say, flowers or sunsets. And so for us, once again, we credit that to that predisposition. However, he would claim that's universal knowledge, things that have been passed down in the unconscious. So slightly different framing on stuff that we do know exists. Again, we have that problem of how would we distinguish between a biological predisposition and shared knowledge? It's kind of hard to quantify a universal unconscious. And this diagram, I just included this from one of the textbooks where he looked at equivalent symbolism between different places. I find this isn't super helpful, but this over here saying that things like we often see pyramids in different places, so that symbol must be something important in that collective unconscious, and so we see it repeating throughout cultures, throughout time, because it's something that's passed down from all humans. And other things like that. Obviously, there's a whole bunch of oddities to that. We could delve into it more, but I'm going to try and stick to just the basics. If we move over to Adler, Adler also grew up in Vienna, which I believe is where Freud was, and became a member of Freud's inner circle in a more direct interaction way. He really disliked Freud's focus on sexual conflict. He looked at Freud's focus on sex and those types of urges and said, that's way too extreme. That's definitely not as big of an effect on our behavior as you are making it out to be. So I want to change it up. So he said that human motivation, instead of being driven by sexual urges, was more driven by our goal of superiority. So we wanted to become the best person, the best human. So this is what he called a universal drive to adapt and improve yourself and master whatever life throws at you. You want to succeed and become the best or better than everyone else around you. And so because that's what we're striving for, feelings of inferiority would be what push us to do better. So this is where that concept of an inferiority complex came up, where people could feel so inferior, so far behind everyone else, that it can start affecting their behavior, and especially produce things like anxiety when they try and do things better in the real world. Here we can see compensation, which is the efforts that people would make to try and overcome those inferiorities. And these could be real or imagined inferiorities, especially if you fall in that category of an inferiority complex. You might be sort of overestimating just how negative people would view you. You might feel worse than you actually are. And that would lead to overcompensation because you're trying to hide those extreme feelings of negativity about your own abilities. So you would push too hard to try and do better simply because you feel like you're so far behind. So he'd say that if we include that importance of early childhood, Adler said that children would feel envious of the abilities and accomplishments of those who are older than them. And so they would be very motivated to become better, to advance quicker so that they could reach the performance level of, say, older siblings or adults. So that's like when they start talking about what do you want to be when you grow up, that's that push to become something that you respect, something that you feel would make you a superior human. He started looking at things like birth order and how they could affect personality. So specifically, that tie to those who are younger siblings might be pushed to try and match or exceed their older siblings. And this idea of birth order and personality, or birth order and anything, has actually been studied in a whole bunch of different ways to a lot of mixed results. Adler's perspective on it definitely wasn't super widely accepted, but this ended up being popular for over a century after he originally proposed it. With more recent studies being larger and more specific, so massive sample sizes, they found that, yeah, there kind of is an effect sometimes, but it's usually very, very small and not to the point that it would be something that we'd say is universal or even commonly experienced. Saying that how this works, the home environment itself can actually be pretty strongly affecting this, because if you think about it, the firstborn is in the home with just the parents. There are no other kids around. And then later born children have these older siblings in place. And the presence of younger siblings now changes the environment that the older sibling was experiencing. So that home environment and the shift in that can also be playing a role here. And that could also tie into treatment. So especially with older siblings being present and possibly being capable of now taking care of younger siblings, that could change how their parents view them and treat them.